There is a battle going on inside each person, a silent battle, a war that makes no noise. Often we spend our entire lives trying to identify who is holding us back. We look for someone to blame. We point to circumstances. We attribute our failures to the people who hurt us, the opportunities we didn't have, or the obstacles that appeared in our path. But the truth is that some of life's greatest defeats don't happen because of external enemies. They happen because of enemies we carry within ourselves. There are people who possess the talent, opportunity, ability, and potential to experience something extraordinary, but remain trapped because they have never learned to overcome what is happening in their own hearts. And the problem with internal enemies is precisely this: they are invisible. Can you see an opponent who is ahead of you? But how can you fight something that's inside you? How do you overcome a voice that speaks inside your head? How do you defeat a feeling that appears when no one is looking? How do you fight off thoughts that arise uninvited? That is why so many people live a life of constant spiritual burnout. They fight against everything and everyone, but they never confront what truly needs to be confronted. The first internal enemy that needs to be overcome is doubt. Doubt has enormous destructive power because it doesn't arrive making a sound. It arrives in the form of questions. She approaches slowly. She doesn't immediately say that God has abandoned you. She simply asks, "Does God really care? Is it worth continuing? Are your prayers being answered? Will you be able to do it?" And when these questions find a weary heart, they begin to take root. Doubt is dangerous because it paralyzes. A person who is afraid can still walk. Even a tired person can keep going. But a person dominated by doubt begins to lose the ability to move forward. She questions everything. Question the plans. Question your dreams. Question the promises. He questions even what he was once certain of. Perhaps you've already experienced this. Moments when it seemed like God was far away. Moments when the answers didn't come. Moments when you looked at your reality and thought, "I don't know anymore if it will happen." It is precisely in this place that many battles are won or lost. Because when doubt dominates the heart, faith begins to weaken. But when faith remains steadfast, even without answers, something powerful happens. Faith does not depend on what the eyes can see. Faith continues to believe even when circumstances seem to say otherwise. Perhaps you are experiencing exactly that today. Praying, hoping, believing, but at the same time fighting against doubts that try to weaken your faith. And I want to know one thing. What is the biggest battle you have been facing within yourself? Write in the comments just one word that represents this struggle. It could be fear, anxiety, doubt, insecurity, or anything else. And if this message is already speaking to you, leave a like because it helps this content reach more people who also need to overcome their inner enemies. Now, there is a second enemy that silently destroys many lives. The second internal enemy is comparison. We live in a generation that spends hours observing the lives of others. It has never been so easy to compare. In just a few seconds, you can see someone traveling, thriving, achieving, smiling, celebrating, and seemingly living the perfect life. And without realizing it, the heart begins to enter dangerous territory. You look at your house, and it seems small. Look at your history, and it seems insignificant. He looks at his accomplishments, and they seem insufficient. Comparison steals the joy of living what God has given you, because while you're focused on what's missing in your life, you fail to appreciate what you already have. And there is a truth that needs to be understood. Not everyone who seems happy really is happy. Not everyone who seems fulfilled truly is. Not every photo shows the truth. Not every smile reveals the truth. But comparison makes you believe that everyone else is better off than you. And when that happens, another, even more dangerous enemy is born: ingratitude. And do you know what the problem is? Many people spend years trying to win these battles through willpower alone. They try to control their thoughts. They are trying to overcome their anxiety. They try to combat the comparison. They are trying to free themselves from guilt, but they end up returning to the same cycles. That's exactly why I developed the ebook, Before the Fall. In it, I show how to identify the triggers that weaken your spiritual life, how to recognize the most dangerous moments of temptation, and what practical attitudes help strengthen self-control in daily life. If you feel like you're fighting internal battles that seem to constantly repeat themselves, the link is in the description and also in the pinned comment. Now there is another silent enemy that destroys the lives of many people without them even realizing it. Ingratitude is one of the greatest poisons of the soul, because it makes you lose the ability to recognize the blessings you have already received. You start to see only what you haven't yet achieved, that which has not yet happened, that which is still missing. And suddenly you forget everything that God has already done. Forget about the doors that were opened. Forget about answered prayers. Forget about getting away with it. Forget about the victories. Forget about the times you thought you couldn't go on, but you did. An ungrateful heart never finds satisfaction, because he will always be looking for the next conquest to finally feel complete. But the truth is that no one finds fulfillment by accumulating things. True fulfillment arises when we learn to value what we already have. There is a spiritual power in gratitude. Gratitude changes the way we see life. She changes the perspective. It changes the atmosphere. It even changes the way we face difficulties, because a grateful person understands that there are still reasons to keep going. Even on difficult days, even amidst the struggles, even when things didn't go as planned. Therefore, before looking at what is still missing, look at what has already been delivered. Before complaining about what hasn't happened yet, remember what has already happened. Before focusing on the problem, remember the blessings you've received. Perhaps you'll discover you have far more reasons to be grateful than you imagined. And when doubt, comparison, and ingratitude begin to lose their power, you open up space for something new to be born within you. But there is another, even more subtle enemy. An enemy that brought down strong people, that destroyed relationships, that ruined ministries, that has led people away from God's purpose. And that's who we're going to talk about now. If there is an enemy that works silently within the human heart, that enemy is pride. And precisely because it is silent, it becomes extremely dangerous. Nobody wakes up in the morning saying, "Today I want to be proud." No one readily admits to being dominated by pride, because pride rarely goes by that name. Most of the time he disguises himself. He wears different clothes. Sometimes it's called self-sufficiency. Sometimes it's called reason. At times, he presents himself as superior. In others, it can be an inability to ask for help. Pride is the feeling that makes someone believe they can live without depending on God. It is the inner voice that whispers, "You can handle it on your own. You don't need to listen to anyone. You already know everything. You don't need to change." And that's exactly where the danger lies. Because all growth begins when we recognize that we still need to learn. Every transformation begins when we recognize that there are still areas that need healing. All restoration begins when we admit that we are not as strong as we thought. Pride closes doors. Humility opens doors. Pride drives people away. Humility brings people closer. Pride builds walls. Humility builds bridges. Perhaps one of the greatest signs of pride is the difficulty in admitting mistakes. There are people who can justify any action. There's always an explanation. There's always an excuse. There's always someone to blame, but regret is rare. And while someone is trying to protect their own image, they end up preventing God from transforming their own heart. Because God works with truth, not by appearance, not with characters, not with masks. He works with sincerity. When someone stops pretending and admits it, I need to change, I need to grow, I need help, then something starts to happen. But there is another enemy that often walks alongside pride: fear. Fear has prevented more dreams from being dreamt than a lack of ability. It has already destroyed more opportunities than the lack of resources. It has paralyzed more people than any external adversary. Fear makes someone give up before even trying. It makes you abandon projects before they even begin. It makes you back away from opportunities that could change your entire life. The problem is that fear always presents itself as prudence. He seems reasonable. He seems intelligent. It looks like protection, but often it's just prison. How many people have missed out on the life God had prepared for them because they waited for the perfect moment, hoping to feel completely safe, hoping to no longer feel insecure, hoping to no longer be afraid? But the truth is that courage is not born when fear disappears. Courage is born when you decide to move forward despite fear. Those who expect to never feel fear will probably never leave their place, because every great step requires faith, and all faith requires movement. There comes a time when you need to stop relying solely on your fears and start listening to what God is saying, because fear will always reveal the risks, but faith reveals the possibilities. Fear says, "You will fail." Faith answers, "You can win." Fear says, "You can't." Faith answers, "With God, you can do it." Fear says, "It's better to give up." Faith answers, "Continue." And in this daily battle, there is another extremely destructive enemy: anxiety. Anxiety is a constant attempt to control what hasn't happened yet. It's suffering over problems that may never exist. It's living for tomorrow without being able to enjoy today. An anxious mind is always racing, always worried, always anticipating scenarios, always imagining the worst. She transforms possibilities into certainties. It turns hypotheses into tragedies. It turns small worries into huge storms. And gradually the person loses the ability to rest. She is physically present, but emotionally, she is already living weeks ahead. My heart races. The mind never stops. The body gets tired, and the soul becomes overburdened. One of the most dangerous strategies of anxiety is to steal trust. Because those who live dominated by anxiety try to carry burdens alone that were never meant to be carried alone. But there is something powerful when we learn to surrender our worries to God. It doesn't mean irresponsibility. It doesn't mean passivity. It means trusting that there is a God taking care of things that are beyond our reach. You do your part, but He understands that He doesn't control everything. And this produces rest. Another internal enemy that needs to be overcome is the need for approval. Many people are living to impress people they don't even really know. They make decisions thinking about what others will think. They choose paths to be accepted. They change their behavior in order to be approved. They live as prisoners of other people's opinions, and without realizing it, they spend their entire lives trying to receive from men what only God can offer. No amount of praise will ever be enough. No amount of recognition will ever be enough. No amount of approval will be enough, because emptiness cannot be filled with applause. Emptiness is filled by identity. When a person knows who they are in God, they stop depending on the validation of others to continue their journey. She doesn't need to prove anything. There's no need to compete, no need to impress. You don't need to play a character. She simply lives, and that produces freedom. But there is one last internal enemy that tends to fuel all the others, an enemy that strengthens pride. It feeds the fear. It increases anxiety. It encourages comparison, and it weakens faith. That enemy is the lie. Because every prison begins when a lie is believed to be the truth. And that's what we'll talk about in the next part, along with practical principles for overcoming these inner enemies and living a life of true spiritual freedom. There is something that all internal enemies have in common. None of them can remain strong without a lie to fuel them. Doubt grows when we believe the lie that God has abandoned us. Fear grows when we believe the lie that we won't be able to do it. Anxiety grows when we believe the lie that everything depends exclusively on us. The comparison grows when we believe the lie that other people's lives are better than our own. Pride grows when we believe the lie that we don't need God. Notice something. Before any downfall can occur externally, it has already begun internally. Every spiritual defeat begins within the mind. Therefore, the greatest battle for a Christian doesn't just happen in certain circumstances. It happens in thoughts. The most fiercely contested battlefield in the world is not in any one country. It's inside the human mind. Because what you believe determines how you live. If you believe you can't, you'll act like someone who is incapable. If you believe that no one loves you, you will constantly live seeking acceptance. If you believe that God has forgotten you, you will lose the strength to go on. But when you replace lies with the truth, everything starts to change. That is why the Word of God speaks so often about renewing the mind. Changing behaviors isn't enough. We need to transform our thoughts. Changing attitudes isn't enough. We need to confront erroneous beliefs, because many people try to change their lives without changing what they think, and they end up returning to the same places, the same mistakes, the same cycles, the same prisons. Imagine someone who has spent years hearing that they weren't good enough, years of hearing words of rejection, years of listening to destructive criticism. Even after growing up, those words continue to echo within him, and without realizing it, he begins to see himself through the wounds he has received. But God does not see us through our wounds. God sees us through the purpose He has placed within us. Perhaps you have spent years believing in things that never came from God. Perhaps it carried labels. Perhaps He was defined by His mistakes. Perhaps it was marked by failures. Perhaps someone told you that you would never succeed. Perhaps someone told you that you weren't capable. Perhaps someone has imposed limits on your life. But there is a huge difference between what they said about you and what God says about you. People's opinions change. Circumstances change. Feelings change. But the truth of God remains. Therefore, to overcome inner enemies, it is necessary to learn how to nourish the mind correctly. No one wins a spiritual battle while living disconnected from God's presence. No one remains spiritually strong by feeding only on bad news, worries, and distractions. Just as the body needs food daily, so does the soul. And often we try to live strong spiritually while feeding our minds with everything except that which strengthens faith. There is a simple principle. What you feed grows. What you neglect weakens. If you constantly feed your anxiety, it grows. If you feed the comparison, it grows. If you feed resentment, it grows. But if faith is nurtured, it also grows. If you nurture hope, it grows. If you nurture gratitude, it grows. If communion with God is nurtured, it grows. Therefore, simply banishing wrong thoughts is not enough. It is necessary to fill the space with correct thoughts. Many people want to overcome sin without changing the environments they frequent. They want to overcome anxiety without changing their existing habits. They want to win the comparison without changing what they consume daily. But transformation requires a decision. It requires taking a stand. It demands discipline. It requires consistency. And that's exactly where many give up, because they seek quick fixes to solve deep problems. But spiritual growth rarely happens overnight. It's a process. It's a walk. It's a daily process. These are small decisions repeated continuously. It's choosing to trust when it would be easier to give up. It's choosing to be grateful when it would be easier to complain. It's choosing to forgive when it would be easier to hold a grudge. It's choosing to obey when it would be easier to follow one's own impulses. It is these small choices that shape great destinies. The truth is that no one wakes up spiritually strong by chance. No one develops maturity by accident. No one defeats their inner enemies simply by wishing to win. We need to confront them, recognize them, confront them, and replace them with the truth of God. Perhaps today you have identified some of these enemies within yourself. Perhaps you've realized that doubt is stealing your faith, that comparison is stealing your joy, that pride is hindering your growth, fear is paralyzing your steps, that anxiety is consuming your strength, or that old lies are still controlling their decisions. If that's the case, remember one thing. You were not called to live as a slave to these things. You were not created to be dominated by them. You don't need to spend the rest of your life carrying burdens that God never asked you to carry. There is freedom. There is a cure. Transformation is happening. But it all begins when you decide to stop fighting only against external problems and start facing what is happening inside you. Because the greatest victory is not defeating someone. The greatest victory is conquering that which tries to dominate your own heart. And when the inner enemies lose their power, you begin to experience something that no circumstance can take away: peace. A peace that doesn't depend on money. It doesn't depend on recognition. It does not depend on approval. It doesn't depend on status. It doesn't depend on perfect circumstances. It is the peace of those who have learned that God remains in control. It is the peace of those who understand that the battle exists, but they are not fighting alone. It is the peace of those who have discovered that true freedom begins within. And when the interior is transformed, the exterior inevitably begins to change as well. Therefore, before trying to change the world around you, allow God to transform what exists within you. Because the biggest giants we face are not in front of us. Often, they are within us, and it is precisely these giants that need to be defeated. Before I conclude, I want to speak directly to you who realized, during this message, that your greatest battle is not happening around you, but within you. Perhaps you're tired of falling into the same patterns. Perhaps there are thoughts, desires, temptations, or behaviors that seem to return repeatedly, even after so many attempts to change. And the truth is that many setbacks don't happen suddenly. They begin much earlier, in small decisions, in small thoughts, and in triggers that often go unnoticed. That's why I created the ebook, Before the Fall. In it, you will learn to identify warning signs, recognize the triggers that weaken your spiritual life, and develop practical strategies to strengthen your self-control and win the battles that take place in secret. If you want to stop just fighting the symptoms and start treating the root of the problem, I'll leave the link in the description and also in the first pinned comment. Don't postpone the transformation that God can begin in your life today. Click the link, check out the material, and take the next step towards the freedom you've been searching for. May God bless you, and never forget. The greatest victories don't happen when we conquer the world, but when we conquer what tries to defeat us from within.